Can we please give a huge whoop cheer and welcome to Paul Franczak.
Okay, I hope I can be heard. Do let me know if you can't at the back. But anyway, on with the talk. Arse first out of history is not just my natural delight and vulgarity. It's a jibe that was made about Thames Watermen until really quite recently. Nowadays, we have the Watermen and Lightermen Company in London, and that is very respectable. That is not Arse first. In fact, it's charity and good deeds first. They even have 52 pensioners' cottages here in Hastings, others over at Ditchley. Oh no, I am talking, get this right away, here we go. I am talking about the Watermen up until about 1814, but that's far too long. Tim just didn't want that length of time. And so I'm mainly concentrating on the period that we sort of call Shakespeare's time. Shall we say 1580 to 1642? The Watermen in this period were an underclass. They were despised, and they were dismissed as thugs, as rogues, and so it has gone on, right up until, could we say, 1860s, when Charles Dickens, you'd have thought better of him, has another go at the Watermen in his last full novel, and we start with Rogue Riderhood and Gaffer Hexam to the horror of his lovely daughter Lizzie, pulling a dead body out of the Thames towards the Jolly Bargeman pub. It went on and on. But first, why did I personally become interested? Well, it all started with playbills. Now, playbills from Shakespeare's period. He didn't live for all of it, but it'll do. I was reading a book in which an historian had asked herself the question, how did people know what was on at the theatre, especially over the river at Bankside in Southwark, in Shakespeare's day? How did they know? And so she thought, text. That's how they knew, text. Because in London there were posts everywhere. There were pissing posts, there were posts for horses, there were posts where you stuck information. And she thought, well, it's the playbills. That's how they knew. So there was a problem. None of them exist. There are no playbills extant from the period. They must have been up there every day. So quite rightly, she thought, well, if I haven't got any playbills, what we'll do is we'll look at how playbills are talked about in Shakespeare's period. And she found quite a lot of references. She found, for example, one lady, this is not my play yet, one lady who had sent her servant out to take the playbill from the post and bring it indoors so she'd know what was on at the theatre. So that ended up as covering for a mustard pot or something because paper was so expensive. And of course the next person coming down the road wasn't going to know. So that's how one text went missing, she nicked it. But a missing text is the torment of literary historians. If there's one thing they loathe, it's a missing text. There is even, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, something called the Lost Plays Database. It's run a bit like a police missing person unit, that you'll suddenly find that a play called The Spanish Viceroy, last seen in the vicinity of Drury Lane and the Cockpit Theatre in 1616, any information? So I thought, well, we've got no playbills, only references in plays. But then I went to Stratford-upon-Avon, just before lockdown, February 2020. And we were going from the Premier Inn down to the Swan Theatre by the river, Othello taxis, and the taxi driver says, where are you going? Told him, said, oh, what you seen? King John. Oh, the King John. The King John's all right. I've heard a lot about the King John. On he went, etc., about the King John. Good job, we got the King John, otherwise we wouldn't have anyone coming to the theatre. So I thought, well, it's the Watermen. It's the Watermen that had the knowledge who was performing, what was performing, and moreover, what other people thought about it. But I'd problem. There aren't any watermen, just like there aren't any playbills. So I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll see how often watermen are mentioned in the plays of the period. Would you believe it? It's more often than playbills. Here's only one example, that's all I've got time for tonight, where a waterman in a play called The Roaring Girl, 1611, and someone wants information to find a woman called Moll Frith. First port of call, Trapdoor, who's like an agent investigator in the play, is the waterman, as you can see. And there is Moll Frith, a rarity, because she was a cross-dresser. She was one of the very few people who ever had a play written about her in her own time. You try writing a play about a civic dignitary or an aristocrat and you are in serious trouble. But since Moll Frith was underclass, that was all right. But the watermen would know where she was. So, here is an heroic image of your Thames watermen. That, believe it or not, is Old London Bridge. Looks like it should be some sort of underground river. And they are doing what is called shooting the bridge. Old London Bridge, the only bridge in London with its 19 arches, 12 to 19 foot wide. At flood or ebb tide, there was a 6-foot waterfall, one side or the other. And there were specially skilled watermen that could shoot the bridge, although some of them did drown and so did some of the passengers, and Queen Elizabeth, or Princess Elizabeth, tried it once in 1554 and never ever did it again. In fact, she never crossed London Bridge because it was stinky and horrible. So, in 1555, all of a sudden, Queen Mary, who come to the throne in 1553, she passes an act through Parliament that really vilifies our watermen. Here's a bit of her choice descriptions. They are rude, they are ignorant. They commit felonies, they commit murders. They are criminals under the guise of rowing the river. They must be brought under control. There will be 8 overseers or rulers of watermen, drawn from the best and wisest sort, and they will be householders, and they will control watermen. Now, she was pretty worried about getting married to King Philip of Spain, and all things were difficult because of her particular problems about Catholicism. What had happened also was that a load of blokes under Thomas Wyatt from my neck of the woods, Maidstone, had gone up, first of all, to Rochester and upset her army, and then arrived in Southwark, where for 3 days they dug trenches. The citizens wouldn't let them get over the bridge. Good job, the watermen didn't help them. The watermen were a danger. From that day to this, if not before, the watermen had the most dreadful reputation. There's a more typical illustration of the miseries of London. In this case, Thames watermen. 1807, they've got whacking great pewter badges on, cost 3 shillings each to the waterman, and that wasn't even introduced till 1803, because in the first 5 years of the 19th century, it was a time of maximum impressment along the River Thames. And the Thames watermen made a big part of Nelson's navy, another big name. So they were also constantly impressed into the navy. Do you know, I'm almost happy with just throwing the voice. Is that all right? Can you hear me? Yeah. Right. And 120 wherrymen are conscripted just to guard the fuel supply in London. And yet they are the scum of the earth. They are despised, as I said. The impressment of Thames watermen went on for all this period, and they formed the largest concentrated, available naval reserve for both Royal Navy ships and armed merchantmen in the service of the Muscovy Company, the Newfoundland Company, the East India Company. It's your Thames watermen, but they're not. They're horrible thugs that drown people and rob them in the river. So then we come to our historians. Andrew Gurr, marvellous, ever so important in the history of Shakespearean theatre. But he gets the price of crossing the river wrong. He tells us that it would cost you sixpence to cross the river in Shakespeare's day, and if you weren't rich enough to afford that, you'd go over the bridge. Two things wrong there. One, it didn't cost sixpence, it could be a lot cheaper. There were three sorts of watermen: scullers, one man in a boat going arse towards the direction, two men, long oars, in a standard Thames wherry, and a tilt boat that had a cover. When the prices were first fixed by Queen Mary, it cost you a halfpenny to use a sculler to cross the river, not sixpence. It also says the poor used the bridge. Too blooming true, if they really, really had to. There's only a 12 to 14 foot pathway on that old London bridge. There it is. And if you could see more closely into that illustration, you'll see people drowning, boats overturned, you'll see people lowering buckets to get delicious polluted Thames water, a bit like it is today, I gather. And you did not cross that bridge against the cattle and cartloads of turnips and spend over an hour to make the journey at peak times unless you really had to. You hired a cheap ferry. Why did it cost sixpence? Because the title is The Privileged as Playgoers in Shakespeare's London. Well, actually, you didn't have to be that privileged unless you chose to pay sixpence to have the boat to yourself, because the wherries were 5-seaters, and if you wanted as a gentleman to cross the river, you bought the boat. Now, this engraving of the Thames became standard. Have I really only done 11 minutes and 7 seconds, Tim? Does it feel like that to you out there? You know, I feel I'm on about 20 minutes here. So anyway, this engraving became standard. I would like to draw your attention, oh I can, to that. That is a galley force. It had sails and it had oars. And John Norden tried to make a bob or two out of this in 1624 when it was part of what he presented to the Lord Mayor of that year, John Gore. Now, that galley foist, I am told, at the London Museum, shouldn't be there. It's square-rigged, you see, so it can't go under the bridge because the drawbridge hasn't been used since the early days of Henry VIII. It was always there because the Thames watermen each year supported the Lord Mayor's show. October the 29th every year normally started with a river pageant, a river triumph. That galley foist was equipped with cannon, it was equipped with musketeers, and it was part of the big hurrah that was made for the Lord Mayor's show. Galley foist, manned by watermen. The actual show on the Thames, it was the watermen that created the cordons, that created the performance areas. They did it in 1610 for the inauguration of Prince Henry as Prince of Wales. They did it in 1613 for the marriage of King James's daughter, Elizabeth, to Frederick of Bohemia. The watermen actually created the performance space. But if you read a historian, they will say, galley foist rowed by mariners. Of course it blooming was. Because watermen were mariners, not all of them, and even sailors, when they returned to shore, courtesy of Trinity House, could be given a licence to become a waterman on the Thames. They were loathed by the watermen, they were called hog grubbers. There we are, 1616, the Dutch had ripped off John Norden and created a lovely coloured illustration. There's the galley foist, which is always that side of the bridge. Down here you've got square-masted, up here you've got an eel boat, yacht rigged, and loads and loads and loads of wherries. So, The Thames Wherry looked like that. Now this is an 1829 illustration, so they look a lot more comfortable than they might have done in Shakespeare's time. But you can see it's a 5-seater, but more than that, I want you to see that it's a conversational space. There they are, arse backwards, with the sharp front pushing in among other boats. And it's conversational, if people want to talk. So I've come to 4 names. John Lowe is the only non-wherryman. He was an actor in Shakespeare's time, from 1605 to 1642. He was a very big man. He was also a king's porter. He was also a goldsmith, apprenticed to a goldsmith. And there's one biography published in 2013 of John Lowe, who actually did work with Shakespeare. Shakespeare wasn't really alive for the whole period that I'm talking about. And he lived in Southwark. He lived among watermen. My biography tells me he was great friends with chandlers, with rich people, especially a guy called William Austin, who was the richest man in Southwark. This is not the complete truth. He lived next door to watermen. He was a great friend of the Platt family. He looked after Widow Platt when her husband died in 1635. He went to meetings with William Oakey, the waterman, as an overseer of the poor, etc. Is that really 1546, Tim? How are you making it?
Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah.
Because that Polish bear story overran, didn't it? I don't want you to get a thing about Polish. Right, okay. And so my biography says, published 2013, none of this. John Lowe mixed with the better sort. He very well did not only mix with the better sort. He went to the same pub as his neighbours William Oakey and Edmund Platt. We have enough, because it is recorded that as overseers of the poor, they attended the annual gathering of the Ship or the Cat Pub in Southwark. They were neighbours. Don't tell me they didn't walk there together. So my watermen, who know about what's on over at Bankside, who know about who's in it, who know about what the story is, are actually living cheek by jowl, first Shakespeare quote, in Southwark with the actors. And it wasn't just John Lowe, it was other actors that I could name but won't proceed. So, listed with, sorry, I'll go back. John Taylor was a waterman. He was a publicist. He was what we would call now a celebrity or an influencer. He published, remember all watermen are illiterate, although some of them left books in their wills, and Tilbury Strange actually signed documents for the Merchant Tailors Company, but they're illiterate. Some of them were, many of them were, but not all. John Taylor did stunts, like going down the Thames in a boat made of paper. He was an ardent royalist. He left the river when the king left London in 1642. But we know a lot of what we do know about watermen from his writings. Tilbury Strange was a friend of his. They travelled to Bohemia together in 1620, and Tilbury Strange occurs in the Ironmongers' Company lists, the Merchant Tailors' lists, as a coordinator of the Lord Mayor's show, looking after the galley foist, having it repainted and recasted at a carpenter's near the Fortune Theatre in Golding Lane. Tilbury Strange moves over to Ratcliffe Stairs, below Bridge, Gravesend side. And at that stairs, here's what he had. When he goes in 1624 to man the galley foist for one of the biggest river triumphs at his own plying station, Ratcliffe, there are those wherrymen credited with that naval experience and those naval skills, including trumpeters, very important to the Navy in this period and to the merchant Navy. Quarter gunners were people who didn't work on the quarter deck so much as look after 4 guns. Lord Mayor's show, you can see the wherries. There are people hanging from windows. There's the royal family at Whitehall stairs. Charles II coming towards the end of his time, his wife, Catherine, and the barges of the 12, not the 12 barges there, but the 12 great livery companies. A waterman's event. The galley foist off over towards Bankside, letting off its guns and all the rest of it. Where are they going? Well, if they're passing Whitehall, they're going up to Westminster and coming back down to Paul's Wharf to go to the cathedral. The cathedral at this time, of course, is the old St. Paul's. And the wherrymen are not only making a lot of profit, rowing arse backwards, as you can see, they're also crucial to the propulsion of the barges and the cordoning of the show. Things weren't always good for wherrymen. A few months after that idealised picture, we had a real, genuine Thames frost. And you can see that the watermen are on hard times. In fact, there we are, there's some. Teams of 4 watermen with boats on runners pulling people across the ice. They did other things. They marked out safe paths and conned people into believing that they were safe paths, when in fact they were no more or less safe than some of the adjacent ice. But there were times when the Thames Wherrymen, coming up, couldn't do anything about it. 1621 was a different matter. There's the Thames whipped up by winds. This is above Bridge Thames, east wind through those arches, I would conjecture, and the Thames has been thrown up into hills and mountain-like landscapes, and the wherrymen can't do much about that. Well, they can. They apply to the Privy Council of James I for poor relief. Knock, knock. They were told, you've got to put up with it, bricklayers have to put up with it, working men have to put up with it, no poor relief. Okay, so they didn't get much change out of James I. And then, right on the spot now, Tim, not much longer. Now, there's been a lot of delight in publishing that summation of the muster book for the crew of HMS Victory from October 1805, because you can't talk about the Navy, can you, unless you talk about the Battle of Trafalgar, well, it's like talking about football without mentioning the 1966 World Cup. And you can see there are a lot of foreign people, but the vast majority are Englishmen. And if you actually look at the muster books, the vast majority of origin for the Englishmen, they were Welsh, they were Scottish, they were Dutch, is London. And so right down to the end of impressment in 1814, watermen were crucial to this country's navy. But nobody really seems to want to speculate about their really important role in our theatrical history, our city history, our postal history, that took letters up and down the river, our military history. And, it's an inverted commas word these days, I know, our colonial history. It's your Thames watermen. They're there, they're accumulated. At this time, only old men and boys were left running the river, the rest by a Captain Richbell, who was in charge of the Port of London in the early 1800s, has impressed the lot. So, I say, as I began, they've been rowed arse backwards out of history. A lost text is far more important than a lost waterman. Text is more important than testimony. What testimony do we have? We have some. Watermen complained to the Privy Council. They revealed information, they collected information. More details available, but if I'd used footnotes, I'd have made no headway whatsoever. So thank you very much. Thank you.